Today we're going to start graphing the sine and cosine functions. So the other day we talked about how we shifted the graph, and we'll talk about that as we go through. But we're going to start with just the very basic sine and cosine graph. So what does y equals sine x look like, and how do we graph that basic graph? So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to plug numbers in. So we're going to plug in 0 for x, we'll plug in pi over 2, and so forth. Now when we plug that in, we're using that unit circle. So let's draw that out. Just so you remember, here's 0. Up here is pi over 2, here's pi, here's 3 pi over 2, and all the way around is 2 pi. So if I want to find the sine of 0, if I'm plugging 0 in for x, remember here I'm thinking of what is the sine of 0. Well, the sine of 0 is coming from right here, and that's that ordered pair that we have right here, and that's our point 1, 0. So the sine is our y value, which is 0. So we know that this point would be 0. If we look at pi over 2, we're going to be up here on our unit circle. So thinking about that point that we have right here, this is our point 0, 1. And again, if we're thinking of the sine is our y value, which is 1. If we go and plug in pi, so we would be taking the sine of pi. Well, the sine of pi is going to be over here. This is your point -1, 0. So the sine would be 0. If we're looking at 3 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2 is down here. So this point that we would have is the point 0, -1. And our sine function there would be -1. And then we're looking at 2 pi. So if we go all the way back around to 2 pi, our sine is going to be once again 0. These numbers are the numbers we're going to use for x every time. So we're always using the 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And that's because our maximum and minimum values are going to be going between 1 and -1, and our x-intercepts are at 0. So one thing that I want you to think about, and I'm going to take this, oops, I can just get this part off. Oh. Well, let's ignore this for right now. And this 0 right here we can think of as an x-intercept. The 1 is a maximum point. Then we get another x-intercept. Then we get a minimum point. And then we get another x-intercept point. This should be your pattern every time when you're looking at that sine function. So as we start switching things around, you're always going to go from an x-intercept, maximum, x-intercept, minimum, x-intercept. And let's see how that graphs over here on the right. So we're using 0, which is going to be at our origin, which is right here, and then we're going up by pi over 2. So here's 1 pi over 2. Remember, 2 pi over 2 is the same thing as pi, 3 pi over 2, and 4 pi over 2 is the same as 2 pi. And we are going between 1 and -1 on our y-axis. And then we're just going to plot the points that we have from here. So we have the point 0, 0, the point pi over 2, 1, pi 0, 3 pi over 2, -1, and 2 pi 0. And your graph is going to curve. If you remember what the graph looked like from the other day of notes, it's just curving up and around. And that's one full period. From 0 to 2 pi is one period of our sine function. Note that the key points start at x equals 0 and occur every pi over 2 units on the x-axis. So these are what we call our 5 key points. And the points from x equals 0 to x equals 2 pi cover exactly one period, which we just talked about. Next, we're going to look at the basic graph of the cosine of x. So we're going to do just like we did before, where we're going to plug in 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. So if we take the cosine of 0, again, thinking back, here, let's move this down just a little bit. Thinking back to our unit circle, if we're at 0, we're right over here. This is the point 1, 0. And now we're looking for the cosine or the x value. So 0 would be 1. If we do pi over 2, remember pi over 2 is up here at the top. That point would be the point 0, 1. So cosine is x, so now x is 0. Cosine of pi, we would be over here on the left, which is the point -1, 0. So our x value is -1. 3 pi over 2, we're down here. This is the point 0, -1. So we go back to 0. And then if we go all the way around to 2 pi, we're back where we started with at 0, and our cosine would be 1. So notice we also do our alternating 0 every other one, just like the sine function. The difference is the cosine is starting at 0, 1, where the sine starts at 0, 0. So let's graph this. Again, we're going up by pi over 2. So we have 1 pi over 2. 2 pi over 2 is the same as pi. 3 pi over 2. And 2 pi is the same as 4 pi over 2. We're going between 1 and -1 on our y-axis. So let's graph. We've got 0, 1, pi over 2, 0, pi -1, 3 pi over 2, 0, and 2 pi is back up at 1. As you draw your graph in, remember it is rounded, as it's going to start taking on those shapes afterwards. So this will come rounded this way and back up again. And as we approach this point from here to here, again, it's rounded as it's going to be coming back down again. Note that the key points, again, start at x equals 0 and occur every pi over 2 units on the x-axis. And that we're going from 0 to 2 pi, which is 1 full period. If you have questions, let me know.